warm welcome from our side to the next episode of the GlobeDrought online lecture series on understanding and assessing drought risk. My name is Hagenlocher. I'm a senior researcher at United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security based in Bonn, Germany. Here at UNU EHS, I am actually leading the subcomponent of the GlobeDrought project.
Hello everyone, I'm Isabel Meza. I'm a research associate in UNU EHS and I am doing also my PhD in the GlobeDrought project.
Our lecture today will aim at providing answers to the following key questions. Why is it actually relevant that we have a better understanding and more accurate assessments of drought risk? What does it actually mean when we talk about drought risk? How can we conceptualize it? And what are relevant components and drivers of drought risk? Further, we want to look into the question of what is actually the state of the science when it comes to assessing drought risk at different spatial scales, maybe from the local to the global, but also for different sectors. What are persisting gaps? And what do we believe and other colleagues of ours believe are future directions? Here you can see an animation that shows agricultural drought hazards for the past 30 years, more precisely for the period 1981 to 2018. And what you can very nicely see is that actually large parts of the world have been quite heavily affected by mild to even severe or extreme droughts in the past years. And often these drought events lead to very devastating and cascading impacts on ecosystems, also agricultural livelihoods or livelihoods in general, notably those depending on water availability, and in turn also on entire economies. Now the question is, how is this picture going to change in the future? And while there is ambiguity and uncertainty regarding drought trends and drought hazard trends in the past century, there is increasing confidence that with climate change, we will see an increase in the frequency, but also the severity, and likely also the duration of hazardous drought events in the next century associated with climate change. And the figure that you can see here actually shows very nicely, it's taken from the latest IPCC 1.5 degree report, and it shows that with increasing temperatures, we also expect an increase in the number of extreme events, including droughts. And for that particular reason, and also due to the fact that we see these cascading effects and these impacts of drought events, a number of recent policy frameworks and agendas have been adopted by the international community. Here I just want to maybe refer to two relevant and recent ones. One is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was adopted by UN member states in 2015 with the aim to reduce current and prevent future risk. And to be a roadmap for countries on how to do that. And another one that is maybe a bit more targeted towards the drought community is a recent outcome of the UN CCD COP in 2019, where they looked at drought impacts and the role of vulnerability. And here I would like to quote from that report: to manage drought risk effectively, it is important to understand the likely impacts, but also who and will be at risk and why. And this is exactly where risk assessments come into play. But what does actually understanding drought risk really mean? So let's look into a specific case study. Maybe many of you still remember the severe drought events that have hit the country of South Africa over the last years. And these drought events have very clearly shown that actually if you want to understand the risk of impacts associated with these droughts, we should not only look at the key characteristics of the drought events and the drought hazards as such as the frequency or the severity or the duration or the onset of the drought, but we also need to look into the broader socioeconomic and political factors that actually exacerbate some of those impacts through vulnerabilities. This is also quite nicely reflected in one of the latest conceptual risk frameworks of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the graphic that you can see here is the risk framework put forward by the IPCC in their 5th assessment report in 2014. And it shows that the risk of impacts associated with climate change and climate-related extreme events such as droughts is not only a function of the drought hazard alone, but is also quite heavily linked to exposure. So the question, what are the elements of the system that are located in areas that can be adversely affected by a drought, and questions of the vulnerability.
The question now is, how is in the drought community conceptualized and assessed drought risk? To answer this question, we perform a literature review using the search engines Web of Science and Scopus, with predefined search terms like drought vulnerability, drought risk, among others. We obtained 568 articles from Web of Science and 573 from Scopus. On a second selection process, titles, keywords, and abstracts of the identified articles were screened independently by 3 researchers. A total of 105 articles were selected and then reviewed and coded using the MaxQDA software. Very interesting results were found, but I would like to point out 3. First, despite the relevance of assessing drought hazard according to the sector we want to study, most articles do not specify what type of drought they are assessing. This is particularly relevant for drought, given that the different drought types have very different implications in terms of potential impacts and policies to mitigate these impacts. Second, in addition to the variety of different risk definitions that have been used for characterizing and assessing drought risk, there is a high number of drought risk assessments that do not specify how drought risk is conceptualized in their assessments. This not only creates confusion when it is operationalized, but also complicates the comparability of its outcomes. Third, the majority of drought risk assessments still focus on the social dimension and do not necessarily apply an integrative approach that includes social ecological systems. This social ecological systems perspective could help to understand and evaluate the role of degraded ecosystems as a driver of drought risk. Furthermore, the role of ecosystems and their regulated services is an opportunity for drought risk reduction, particularly when we speak and assess drought risk in the context of agricultural systems. That's why we propose to analyze drought risk with a framework that characterizes the risk of adverse drought impacts. The entry point for this framework is the question, risk of impacts of what to what? As different indicators will be relevant when assessing the risk of adverse impacts of drought on crops, and of course, we need different indicators if we assess the risk of adverse impacts on food insecurity, for instance. This framework builds on the IPCC 2012 framework, and it considers the complex interaction of the 3 components of drought: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. It also considers the mitigation of anthropogenic climate change and integrate water resource management, which can help to reduce drought hazards. While drought risk reduction and drought risk management, including risk transfer, and adaptation, aim to reduce exposure and vulnerability. With this overview, what are the implications for drought risk assessments? There is a lot of progress understanding the physical process underlying drought propagation and the human role in enhancing and mitigating drought. Also, drought risk assessments, monitoring, early warning systems are increasing for different sectors and at different scales, both globally and locally, which is very good. However, we're still facing some challenges. Further research is needed to assess the dynamic of risk and its effects of an interconnected world. These temporal and spatial dynamics will help us to understand how the future could evolve and how to adapt better. Further research on sector, context, and scale-specific drivers of risk is needed in order to improve the monitoring, assessment, understanding, and ultimately management of the drought risk effectively. Risk assessments are data-driven, which will have some degree of uncertainty, as in the data as in the models. This uncertainty needs to be measured and communicated as the results of this should be linked to funding allocation and adaptation planning. Also, every drought risk assessment should be validated, either technically or through expert consultation. Do we find on the models a higher risk where the higher impacts really were? Finally, it is necessary to understand the systemic nature of drought risk and its cascading impacts in order to better manage drought risk and move towards more resilient ecosystems and societies. If you want to have more information about drought risk and discuss with our experts about these topics, please sign up for our upcoming webinar.